Good morning. How's everyone? Hanging in there? I wrote something up on the board that I probably don't need to remind you about, but we have a long weekend coming up, if that helps. Right, it's like right about now, as we're all like settling in, that we start to like get tired, I think. Like it's like the newness of being back at school wears off and we're all just like tired. So we get a nice long weekend to hopefully sleep in and recover. I have family coming in, so I'm not as excited as I should be about the weekend, right? Like my sister-in-law and her kids, which are like, they're like in that moody teenage phase where they don't want to do anything. So my kids are like, what's wrong with them? I'm like, oh, be you and it's like, but yeah, so I get to hang out with them all weekend. The only upside is we always go out and eat like every day over here. So at least on the plus side, I get lots of good food. Trying to look for the silver line. We do have a long weekend. I won't see you Monday, so I will see you next after today on Wednesday. So in a week, which feels like a long time. Happy and sad, mostly happy. So we're gonna pick up with our next chapter, right? So we skipped chapter 3 for now. We'll go to chapter 3 and 7, kind of cover them together. 3 is all about communication, and so we'll get there in a few weeks. But we're going to look at chapter 4 today, which is having to do with gender development, gender roles, gender identity. I thought I was being really creative. I had black, white, purple, blue, and pink. I had like all the colors of the gender flag, but everyone I showed it to was like, I don't see it. So I'm telling you so that you know it's there because I was excited about it. But we'll talk about sex versus gender, what forms our gender identity, some stereotypes, some varieties of gender, and so on. And that'll be our topic for the next 2 classes. And so starting here, let's talk about sex versus gender. And I think a lot of you kind of had a unique opportunity with your research last time to see that not everybody knew what sex versus like sexual orientation and things like that are, let alone sex versus gender. They are technically different things. Your sex and your gender, for a lot of people, they align, but they don't have to be the same thing. And so once you understand how they're different, you can start to argue how they influence each other and are somewhat the same. But let's talk about how they're different, because they are a little bit different. So when we talk about somebody's sex, versus gender, when we talk about sex, we're talking about somebody's biology, their physiology, their sex organs, their sex characteristics. Sex has a lot to do with like biology, or we could say anatomy. Do you have a penis or a vagina? Do you have breasts or not? Though men can have breasts as well. It's much less common, but it can definitely happen. What is your anatomy? Like your physiological, biological anatomy and structures that you have both internally and externally. It has a lot to do with chromosomes. Are you XX or XY or XXY? There are some kind of uncommon combinations as well. Typically, we also talk about things like hormones, which we'll talk a lot about later, right? Testosterone and estrogen, right? Your hormones is another big biological indicator. And men and women both possess like combinations of each other's hormones, but they tend to exist in certain proportions for men versus women. Traditionally, when we're talking about sex, we use terms like male, female, or Intersex. Intersex would mean some combination of male and female, maybe some combination of male and female anatomy. But traditionally, sex refers to physical, biological, anatomy, chromosomes, hormones, all biological contributors. Male, female, and intersex would be like the common terms that we would use. Gender, on the other hand, is a little more like social or psychological. It's a little more constructed in nature. So we could say that it's like psychological. It's very constructed. It has social constructions and social meanings to it. We tend to look a lot at like words here like feminine or masculine. The old term, nobody really tends to use this term a whole lot anymore, but the old term was androgynous. It was made famous in the 70s by a psychologist named Sandra Bem. Androgynous, literally combining male, female together to mean someone who's like a blend of the two. A more contemporary term would be like non-binary or genderqueer. There's a whole ton of other terms that we'll talk about. Trans could be another term that we use. So it's more psychological in nature. I could also add social in here if you want to have a balanced number of things, but it's more psychological or constructed or social. It can have different meanings from culture to culture. Feminine, masculine, androgynous, or like non-binary or trans would all be like the common terms that we would use. Very frequent or very common for one to influence the other, right? It's most people who are male identify as masculine. Most people who are female identify as feminine, but not everybody, right? And I would say it's growing in our culture to have more like variety of people who identify as like genderqueer, non-binary, or whatever it might be, whatever term they use, but they are very dependent on each other. And a lot of people just kind of fall in line with their biology, but not everybody, right? And we'll talk about that as well. So your gender identity is how you perceive yourself. And this can be whatever you want it to be, right? Your gender identity is something that you decide for yourself. Am I feminine? Am I masculine? Am I non-binary? Cisgender or like non-binary, right? We have all these different terms that we use, but ultimately it's up to you, right? And it can be something that changes. Our culture, our society doesn't tend to like this to change. You can change it at any time, right? Like we like to put people in neat little boxes, but I think more and more as we get on, people are liking to break those boxes, which I think is great, right? I love that. And I break these all the time. I'll share with you in our household. So that's myself and my partner who's female. And in our house, I'm dad and husband, which is totally outside the norm. And I love watching other people grapple with it. Like it makes me happy on some level. And then at the same time, like I always am like, are they going to be okay with it? But like I'm a coach for soccer and a coach for softball. And so I always have them call me Coach E because it's way easier than my first name anyway. But they will always ultimately ask me, what are your pronouns? Right? And I go by like she or her, but I like to be dad and husband. Like those two are like absolute twins. Like if you call me he, I won't be offended. I'm really hard to offend, period. Right? But don't call me wife or mom, right? Because that influences my kids. So in our house, I get Father's Day and my partner gets Mother's Day. I think that works out well, right? And I fit that role anyway. I'm like totally the stereotypical like dad, right? And so why not, right? And so for me, my gender identity, like I tend to identify as like non-binary or like genderqueer. And I tend to like those pronouns and those roles, but I could change them if I wanted to. And you have that flexibility and openness too. Your gender role or your gender identity are very fluid. That might be something that kind of goes back and forth over the course of your life, right? So your gender role is kind of a collection of all the attitudes and behaviors that are considered like normal or appropriate for your particular gender, right? Lots of stereotypes coming out of this, which we'll talk about as well. And I saw this kind of interesting video. It's really short. It's like 2 minutes or so, but it talks about the difference between gender and orientation. And I was thinking of like your research that a lot of you did last time that people were confused about this. Like, what's your orientation? Male, right? Somebody had that over here. Okay, great. Good to know. So I want to play this for you. I think it has like kind of an interesting distinction, few very common ideas related to gender, right? Gender and orientation are different, as we were talking a little bit about last time. Now, they say that orientation is who you go to bed with, right? It's a little overly simplistic. Your orientation includes a lot more than who you have sex with. It's also who you're attracted to, who you're comfortable being around. We'll talk about that when we get to orientation in a few weeks, right? But I think that's a good way of remembering it in a simplified way, who you go to bed as versus who you go to bed with, right? Little oversimplified, but a good idea. And as they were kind of describing, your gender is that outward expression, right? And I love like the way they're sitting, right? Just the way that you sit, the way you do your hair, the way you dress, all of those things are gender, right? The preferences that you have. And there's lots of stereotypes that go with that. And oftentimes when people break a gender stereotype, we then make a stereotype about their orientation. Like the second you see like a very feminine man, what's the instant assumption? He's gay, right? Like everyone would say. Or a very like masculine woman, lesbian. Sometimes that holds up. And sometimes it doesn't, right? But it's an interesting kind of linked stereotype that we get. So your gender role and your gender identity are all these like attitudes and behaviors and things that we consider normal and appropriate for the gender that you identify as. And he was talking about the genderbread person. So it used to be that we talked about gender in a very simplistic way. And we're starting to get a little bit more evolved in the way that we talk about gender, how we express it, our identity, our thoughts. They talked a little bit even about biology, right? Playing a role. As we said, these can very much shape each other. And as we're kind of starting to talk about this, any thoughts or questions, any thoughts, anything so far before we keep going? I found a couple of like ideas here as we talk about gender identity and gender roles. And I have a really cool one that I think I'll show you next time. And it looks at like gendered stereotypes for Halloween costumes, which I thought was exciting given the time of year. I'm so ready for Halloween. I know it's still August, but I'm ready. This weekend it was like, I want to do Halloween things. And my family was like, let's go to the beach. I'm like, no, that's summer. Like, where's the pumpkin festival? They're like, it's August. I know, right? But I'm ready. I even have my like orange and brown. I'm ready for fall, right? But I found these really kind of cool clips. One is for men and one is for women, right? Of kind of like the formula or the ideas and expectations of what it means to be male and female. And so I'll play these for you. Let's watch the male one first. And this is a commercial, actually, but it kind of shows you for femininity or identifying as being a woman. And that whole movie is so gendered, right? So much about like the gender norms and stereotypes and expectations that are present and kind of exaggerating some of them and talking about those consequences of them. But we see this a lot, right? These are the injunctions. We sometimes call them gender role injunctions, the expectations that are present for your gender identity. And within our culture, we tend to be way more comfortable with people who conform to that identity and sometimes struggle with people who don't. Any comments or thoughts about either of those at all before we go on? Any comments? Okay. So we just said that gender is socially constructed. It's psychological, right? It's more social. But again, you can't deny that your gender identity is somewhat influenced by your sex. And your sex is determined at a very, very like early stage. It's determined before you're born. At the moment of conception is when we determine someone's sex. And your sex shapes your gender. So let's talk just for a minute about how your sex is formed, just so that we have that base. But biological processes play a big role in sex, obviously. It's a very biological construct. So at the moment of conception, we decide right then and there if you're going to be male or female or other. Intersexed would be the name for other. Right? What is conception? Anyone know what is that? What is the moment of conception? Anyone know what that means? Yeah, that's part of it, right? It could be part of it. Yeah. Cell division. What was that? Cell division. Okay, yeah. So egg and sperm meeting and then dividing. right, would be the moment of conception. So when egg and sperm unite, whether that's through the gesture that you had of intercourse, or it could be through like an assisted reproductive technology. However it happens, the moment that sperm and egg meet is the moment of conception. And at that moment, your chromosomal sex is determined. Okay, so we all possess a pair of what are called sex chromosomes. They're these little rod-shaped bodies that are going to contain all of that cellular information about whether we are male or female or intersex. So at the moment of conception, that starts this process. And then from there, your gonads develop. Your gonads are your sex glands, your ovaries, traditionally for women, or your testes for men. And your ovaries and testes, these gonads, these reproductive gonads that we possess, then release hormones, which help to develop the different structures that you possess. So it's kind of like this cascading effect, right? Of like we have conception, which dictates your chromosomes, which forms the gonads, which then release hormones, and it goes from there, right? And so that's kind of the essence of like how your sex is formed. And I found this little like super brief, but I think it's helpful. It like talks about how sex chromosomes work in case that's not like an area of strength or knowledge for you. So I'll play it. It's really cool or like common differentiation. And once we have that chromosome piece in place, it dictates the gonads, which then dictates the hormones that are released. So everything kind of interacting with each other and influencing your sex, which tends to influence your gender identity. There are a ton of sex hormones, right? And so let's talk about these for a few minutes, and then you'll see most of them again and again and again over the semester. But let's talk about each one of these just a little bit. And there tend to be kind of traditionally male dominant hormones and then female dominant hormones, but we all possess a little bit of each. And they play a big role in a lot of different sexual functions that we have. Right, a lot of different functions from pregnancy to menstrual cycles to puberty. I mean, just the list goes on and on and on. And so let's go through each one of these and kind of look at their main ideas. So the androgens. The androgens, as it says up here, tend to be kind of the traditionally male hormones, right? And so anyone know what is the traditional male hormone that would fall under androgens? Testosterone, right? So testosterone is the male hormone, though women possess testosterone as well, just less of it, right? So traditionally men have more, women have a little less. It plays a really big role in male sexual development. I'm just writing like a couple of key thoughts for each one. And it plays a really big role in one more thing, which is sex drive. And this is one thought why men traditionally have a higher sex drive than women, not always, but stereotypically, because they possess more testosterone, right? Testosterone plays a big role in sex drive. More testosterone, higher sex drive. Yeah.
Babies who are born addicted to opioids tend to like not have like barely any movements. Like when they get older, like they have to take supplements a lot of the time, like the men, because they just don't produce it for some reason. I don't think what's the like science behind it, but
yeah,
they don't produce that many androgens. They have to like take shots.
Interesting. Yeah, that is interesting, and I haven't read that. I don't know a lot about that either. But that's an interesting like finding, right? Kind of weird, kind of interesting, a little bit of both, right? I like that. Any other like thoughts, comments, anything so far? Again, lots of these are just kind of key term or keywords. I thought that might help a little bit. Estrogen, or the estrogens. These are traditionally female sex hormones. Again, men possess them as well, but less of them. So estrogens control female sex development. So we see like female sex organs. They play a really big part in the menstrual cycle, which we'll talk more about when we get there. right? So they dictate when a woman menstruates or not, right? So they have a lot of roles in those things as well. Secondary sex characteristics, they play a big role in pregnancy, which we could also add. Right, so they have a lot of influences as well, right? And we see men having them, but to a lesser degree, right? So again, we have this balance of like male, female hormones that we both possess. Progesterone. Progesterone, as it says up here, is something that's secreted by the ovaries. It plays a really big role in maintaining the lining of the uterus during pregnancy. So when a woman is pregnant, her uterus has a lining in it called the endometrium. We'll talk a lot about that when we get there. And progesterone is the hormone that keeps that lining there, right? And so if there's no lining, then the pregnancy is lost. Progesterone plays a big role in maintaining that, which allows an egg to be implanted into it and grow and develop over roughly 9 months. So it plays a really big role in that. Also a little bit with like milk production and the placenta. So a lot of roles with like pregnancy, like for women. The next one, GnRH. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, right? This one is something that's produced in the hypothalamus, and it stimulates the pituitary gland to release other hormones. So you can almost think of it as like a master hormone. He's the lead hormone, like leader of the hormones, right? Master hormone, it stimulates the pituitary to release other hormones, especially during puberty, right? So it's kind of like this master hormone that we don't talk a lot about, but it can play a big role in like the onset and stimulation of puberty in both men and women. FSH. And again, some of these we'll talk a lot about when we get more to like pregnancy and so on. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. Again, released by the pituitary gland. It has a lot to do with follicular development in women, right? So it helps develop those eggs that a woman releases each month. So we'll say follicular or follicle development. And it plays a role in sperm formation in men. So again, kind of existing in both, right? Playing a role in both men for sperm and women for ovulation and like maturing and formulating those eggs that are released each month. Luteinizing hormone, a couple more, LH. Luteinizing hormone plays a big role in ovulation, right? So what we see here, I'm going to say is that it stimulates ovulation. When a woman ovulates each month, when she releases that egg, there's a huge surge of LH that happens. And you can actually test for this. So if you've ever heard like a couple is monitoring and waiting for ovulation to occur to try and get pregnant, they're waiting and testing for LH. So like a pregnancy test, you can urinate on a little stick that detects LH and it'll tell you when you're ovulating. When you're ovulating, there's an egg there, which helps you to have a higher likelihood of getting pregnant. Something we'll talk more about as well. 2 more, prolactin. Prolactin has a lot to do with milk production. So after a woman gives birth, right, they can breastfeed a child. That is very much kind of mitigated by prolactin. It plays a big role with progesterone and also with like stimulating milk to be produced. And then finally, oxytocin. And I'll leave these up here if you want to like take a picture later, or you can take one with me in it if you want. That's fine too. But oxytocin plays a big role in sex and orgasm. It's often called the cuddle hormone. So when people are physically close to each other and touching in any way, oxytocin is released, right? When people orgasm, oxytocin is released. It also is released when a woman is breastfeeding to help her bond with that newborn baby. Right, so it plays a big role in connection. It's released during physical contact like cuddling or intimacy, during sex and during orgasm. So all of these are some, not all of them, but these are like the big hormones that play a big role, especially these first two, when we're talking about sex and gender development. These two are released, right, the second that those gonads are in place, helping all those structures to formulate, to build, and they play a big part in our gender identity. Yeah.
The last one, is that only, like, with the women and females?
No, for oxytocin?
Yeah.
No, for both men and women, right? So it's released for women when they breastfeed. But it's released for men and women during sex or orgasm or physical
Is
contact.
there a difference in the releases?
No, I wouldn't say there's a difference at like, so it could even be released for men, like when they're feeding an infant. It's sometimes called just a cuddle hormone because it's released when we're physically close to another person. So it could be any kind of like closeness, sexual or otherwise. It tends to facilitate feelings of connection, right? And also intimacy through like sex and orgasm. Yeah.
Are androgens and testosterone interchangeable, or is testosterone a type of?
Testosterone is a type of androgen. So there are other types of androgens, but that is like by far the androgen, right? So it would be a type of. Any other questions for now? Yeah.
Say somebody takes testosterone.
Yeah.
Does that mean that estrogen decreases or does it stay at the same?
It tends to stay at the same, right? So just the testosterone goes up, but the estrogen might stay very flat.
Does like
Not necessarily, right? Testosterone tends to be more dominant than estrogen, right? So when somebody say they're transitioning from like female to male and they start taking testosterone, they're gonna see some pronounced changes. Right. Right, that could be part of it, right? Testosterone tends to dominate over everything. Right, and so when someone takes testosterone, a woman takes testosterone, you see often the growth of hair, right? For the first time, like facial hair or hair in other places. You see sex drive go up, anger go up, physical strength increase, right? There's correlations with like strength and testosterone. So yeah, it tends to be the dominant one, but estrogen would kind of stay level, if that makes sense. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I was gonna say also for a woman, like during our ovulation, like that's when our testosterone is at its peak. So like a lot of times people like say like, oh, like if we want to do this or that or like really intense like workout and stuff, do it during this period. And I want to say it only lasts like maybe 2 weeks. And then like it sucks because then every other time it's like you're either getting ready for the period or you just came off your period. So you only have this peak like for such little amount of time in a month. And it's crazy to think that like a guy has that peak all
All
month.
the time.
But for a woman, it's literally just for that like time.
About 10 days.
Yeah, and I would say like, because you said like with the conflicts, I would say like it's amazing. If it's not public, it's great. Like that's the best time to work.
You're like, I want more
You have,
testosterone.
Yeah, so much energy, like just so good. And, like,
My testosterone is surging. Let's go to the gym.
No, seriously, like,
Right? Yeah.
yeah, and you can like feel it, like, if you really look into that, like the cycle, like the woman's stuff, like, before you get your period, like the eating, the cravings, like you're so tired, you're so this, and then you get your period and everyone always says like, oh, okay, that makes sense, like, because I was in a period.
Yeah.
And it's so weird, like you genuinely feel like that, like it comes over you just like a wave, like all of a sudden you feel so different, so like black. But then like when you have this testosterone, like during the ovulation, like it's such a difference.
Yeah, hormones play a huge role in your mood and the way that you feel. And we're not even talking about other hormones like stress hormones, cortisol, for example, and others. Like when we're stressed, we release an incredible amount of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, which can affect everything from our mood to our weight gain to our hunger. And really interesting, and we'll talk more maybe about it when we get to female anatomy. But like there are a lot of period trackers and like menstrual cycle trackers, and you on that like our apps on your phone, right? And you can keep track of like your mood and the way that your body feels and all these things. And like oftentimes people use those as predictors. Like you mentioned, like, oh, it's coming. Like I can feel like I'm in this space or this space, depending on which stage of that cycle you're in. Really interesting to track that. You can start to look at patterns that emerge.
have your own like natural movements, like.
Yeah.
Discharge and things.
Yeah.
You don't have to take any.
Mhm. Yeah, a lot of people use their menstrual cycle as a form of childbirth, right? Whether it's to help you get pregnant or avoid getting pregnant. There are periods of time, every pun intended, periods of time. There are chunks of time, is that better? I don't know. There are spans of time where there's no egg to fertilize. So pregnancy is almost impossible, right, at that time. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the menstrual cycle. Yeah.
What about like the variation in people being able to feel more like most commonly people who become for emotional cravings, whatever, when things like that are approaching, is a variation in that or lack of that, does that correlate with the amount of hormones or level of hormones, or is that just a person to person thing?
Sure, it can, right? It can. The tricky thing is it's not like we're measuring the amount of hormones that people have. Like, it's not something that we would typically test. I mean, you can do blood work to see how much these things are present. It could just be variety. It's wild, the variety, if we're talking just menstrual cycles, right, for women. Some women are completely derailed by the hormonal influences, and others don't notice it at all. Some people experience PMS and some don't, and some have PMDD, which is even more extreme. So it's kind of all over the map, and it is most likely directly tied to the hormones and the balance, but it's not something that we normally test. So I would say there's a correlation, but it doesn't always cause it. That makes sense. Yeah. Great thoughts. I love it. Yeah.
You say that anger is very prevalent with testosterone?
It tends to play a role in anger, right? And we traditionally see men being more like aggressive, let's say, than women. Like maybe not so much anger, but aggression. So the expression of it in like a violent way tends to be correlated with testosterone, but not always. I mean, there's a huge mental and like cognitive piece to anger, right? Where people can process it and control it and how they express it. So there's a really big cognitive element, but testosterone does tend to correlate with like aggression a little bit more than estrogen does, for sure. Estrogen tends to correlate more with like emotionality, testosterone with aggression. Was that a, what I get what? I mean, they take like when they take like any kind of like steroids, you mean? I mean, it's part of it, right? It's increasing the amount of like muscle mass and testosterone that you have, which is influencing your mood. Again, even something as simple as stress, which we're all constantly experiencing, can influence your mood by the way it releases hormones. Yeah, it's logical. It makes sense. When you manipulate or change your chemistry, there's often effects to that. So again, you'll see a lot of these later, right? We'll come back to a lot of these later in the semester. But our sex definitely influences our gender. And I used this word earlier just to put it up here and define it. Intersexed, which isn't a common outcome, but it can happen, is when somebody possesses biological attributes of both sexes. So it could be that they have external male anatomy and internal female, which would mean that they might not be able to get someone pregnant or get pregnant themselves, depending on the combination that they possess. The old word for this was hermaphrodite. We don't use that word anymore, right? It's considered like inappropriate to use now. But hermaphrodite was the old word. It was a Greek goddess or a Greek deity, I should say, that possessed both attributes. So that's where the term hermaphrodite came from. But the current and proper word to use is intersexed, right? And that again is referring to someone's sex, right? Their anatomy, not their gender identity. I'm not going to go over these because I want to spend our time elsewhere. But in your book, it talks about the two different categories of like intersexed atypical conditions that can happen. I want you to look this over. It might be something I ask you a little bit about on the exam. Like I might ask you, what are the two categories and give me an example from each. So make sure you look it over. But people can have atypical differentiation in their chromosomes. So like XXY, for example, could happen sometimes, or it could be in their hormones. And there's a bunch of different conditions like Turner's, Klinefelter's. There's a bunch of these that the book talks about. So make sure to kind of look that over. I think it starts on like page 80, something it's like 87 or something in your book. But make sure you look those over at some point. I'd like to focus more on like what is like typical, but there are some like rare conditions that people can develop. And different parts of the world have different conditions too, which is interesting. Yeah.
This whole time I've been sitting here, I've been thinking about this case that I learned about, I think in my first psych class, I honestly don't remember. So like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, please, because I'm trying to figure out what I'm like
Sure.
remembering.
Yeah, no worries.
There was like a case where, I don't know if it was a twin thing or what, but there was a person who was born, I believe, a man or a woman, and their parents like physically was with a doctor, they like agreed to like get rid of something. And I, again, could be making all this up in my head, but like,
I
Do you know
I think I know what you're talking about, but keep going, yeah.
yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, they ended up like killing themselves because of, like, they found out later in life that they were like born one thing and then their parents like forced like a gender on them,
Sure,
but inside they were feeling another way. Do you know what case I'm talking, like,
yeah. Do you want to sum up?
I think, they were born, intersex.
Yeah.
But there was it was like, okay, we can do surgery to, assign your child, like one or the other. This one is gonna be easier.
Yeah.
So they
They had to make
did
a
the
choice.
surgery so that the child, was male. And then, he learned later on that he was not that he could have been either, and his parents chose
Yeah.
the easier surgery.
and he did end up like killing
I
himself,
think
right?
Struggled horribly with depression.
Yeah.
And had a very hard time
Was it
not feeling right.
Was it two or
No,
one?
I think it was just
Okay,
one.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
And there are several cases of this, but this is a famous one because of the outcome, right? And what happened, and I'm blanking on the name of it. There's like a whole documentary made about it, and
I
if
was looking
anyone,
it up this whole time and I couldn't
Yeah.
find the name.
right? Oh, my brain is like looking for it. If any of you find it out, like, please, like, share with us. But what happened was they had to make a decision, and they went with the more like obvious, like the easier choice. And then later, as this person hit puberty and like their hormonal influences came forward, there was this like, I'm at odds with my gender and my sex. And then all of this information emerged, and I believe the person felt very like ostracized and like othered, and then struggled so badly with depression that they took their own life. A very like famous case of like looking at how intertwined your biology and gender are, right? And like there are plenty of times where parents will force a gender on a child, right? Like, you're a boy, you're gonna play with this, or you're a girl, you're gonna play with this. But this was like a really extreme example of someone who was intersexed and was raised one way when it could have gone either. Did anyone find it? Anyone? I know I can see you're looking it up, but if you find it, like, feel free to let us know.
David Renner.
Okay, that was the name of it. Okay, it was a twin thing. There's a couple of cases of this, right? There's another case. Well, there's a couple of cases of this that have been like prevalently discussed because of the consequence of the choice.
I think it's just kind of sad,
Yeah,
you know,
for sure.
like how confused that must be, especially like at the time period, you know, it was like,
Mhm.
now it's a little bit, like, we have a lot more understanding of.
Yeah.
like, how, you know, you said like, it's your brain versus like, you know, your that word.
Genitalia.
Yeah.
Mhm.
it's that word.
Sure, sure.
But yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting.
It's just unnecessary because it's like a medical necessity.
Right, and that's kind of the current thought, right, is if it's not a medical necessity, and people even argue that with things like circumcision, which we'll talk about when we get to male anatomy, that should that be a choice that that little boy has later in life? Obviously, much more involved to circumcise someone as a like teenager than as a baby. But you know, those are things that I think we're more aware of now than we were. I thought that was back in the 80s or the 90s, like it's older. But still. So all of that to say that from a combination of biological and like psychological stuff, we form our gender identity, right? Of like masculine, feminine, binary, non-binary, like other, whatever it might be. We form our gender identity, which is very, very much like socially constructed. And it's riddled with stereotypes, right? When it comes to gender, it is such a stereotyped notion and idea, and sometimes they're true, and sometimes they're not, right? I want you to find a few people around you really quickly, and we'll do this a little bit more later as well, so I'm only gonna give you a short period of time. But what are some stereotypes of being masculine? And what are some stereotypes of being feminine, right? Jot them down so that you don't forget, so you can share them. But find a couple of people around you really quick. Stereotypes of like male, female behavior.
Like, for example, like a dress, right? Like most, I mean, it's style, like, no, I or like a price, like pastel yellow.
Someone broke. No, it was broken.
Obviously, that's what we don't
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, that's. Am I, are you not gonna write it down? What else? Every time I say that, I'm like, well, you want to go
Yeah.
yes. Working for.
And like over. I'm going. So. I just. No, I'm like, I'm. Yeah. Yeah. Being. Run all over. Yeah.
I know it is. I'm like, and then I do understand the law. Like, yeah. A moment where I'm like, oh. This is my dad.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah. And then he also like 6:30. I go like go well. This is also so. He's not right. You were in right? So like to that, and then that's other it's like you know like it's show right like you're talking about it's like oh
Bring it back, let's see what you And I love these pictures, because like these little pictures of the brain, give you kind of a good starting point here. And sometimes these things are true, and sometimes they're not, right? They're stereotypes that based on like blanket assumptions about a group of people. But let's start with stereotypes of masculinity or being male. What are some things that you came up with? Give me one that you wrote down. Stereotypes of being male or masculine. Anyone want to?
Strength.
Strength, you're strong, okay, good one. What else? Yeah. Okay, you're the provider. Yeah. Dominant. Oh, she stole your thought, right? Other stuff, yeah. Okay, uncaring, and it could be like characteristics or interests, as we have up here, yeah.
Kinds of jobs that they do.
Okay, so like certain stereotypes about
Yeah.
jobs that are
Right.
typically male, okay, great, yeah,
Loose fitting clothing.
okay, looser fitting clothing, okay. Other stuff, yeah,
Dirty. And not in a bad way.
dirty. Okay, playing in the dirt, right, if you didn't hear that, instead of being dirty, right? Okay, and then up here, right, sex, food, sex, TV, football, beer, sex, right, like, kind of, again, like stereotypical interests, like, men are interested in football, I'm so guilty of this, right, if I meet like a new, like, guy that I don't know, like, I met all these guys at softball that I didn't know, I was like, I'll default to talking about football, right, like, will do that too sometimes, right, like, it's easy to default to these stereotypes of like, okay, well, you're seem to be male. Okay, so these are things that I think men are interested in. I'm gonna talk to you about it, right? Sometimes, and I have coworkers, I'll be like, are you interested in my football league? They're like, football, all right. Well, I don't like you then. Right? Not to be your tenure, but you know, whatever. Anything else for the men that you came up with yet? Handy, okay. Others?
Spells.
What was that?
Spells.
Okay, all right, yeah.
My group talked about how like stereotypically like boys are dogs and girls are cats. And there was like a little bit of a theory of like why do like a dog is a man's best friend, and like the theory is because like dogs are more like they love you anyways and more like submissive than women.
Okay.
So it's like, are men attracted more to like the submissive types even in dogs? And like we talked about how cats, like you have to kind of like earn their love and their trust, and that takes a little longer.
Okay.
So like women are more like
Cats.
So like is it a green flag for a guy who's a cat?
Yes.
Yeah, there we go, right? I like that, right? That's I've heard that before too, right? And the like parallels between the two, right? I told you I have 5 cats, right? And right? That's my kids' fault though, not mine. They just kept adopting them, right? Like, stop, 5 is a lot. Like, yeah,
For masculinity, I'd say like emotional, like intelligence.
okay, okay.
I think men are emotional.
No, they're not.
Oh,
Wait.
Everybody's all like,
Intelligent.
okay.
Right, like, when I think about it, like, I feel like it's just different. Like,
Sure, okay. Emotional intelligence being low,
Lack. I think
right?
they-
Lack of emotional
Yes,
intelligence.
I think
yes,
it
it
takes
is.
some push for them to be. Stereotypically women have to,
Okay.
like they don't have a choice.
Right, you are expected to be emotional or it's part of that. Okay, anything else with men? Anything else that we want to add before we go to the other side? Before we go to the dogs for instead? Yes, I mean, cats. Women, how about women then? Like, we could just say the flip, obviously, but let's go into it, yeah.
Yeah, I have something a little different, and I'm sorry if I yap a lot, but so I grew up in Russia until I was 15.
Okay,
And so we have a lot of stereotypes come on us. Number one, if you were a girl, you didn't learn how to read until you probably 10.
Wow.
Because girls didn't need to read, because all that they had to do was learn how to cook and clean, which I know is kind of like, we do that here, but there, it was pushed so much.
to the extreme.
Yeah, I was cleaning my whole kitchen when I think I was like 5. Like I
Okay.
could learn how, and I knew how to cook by the time I was 6, like full on meals, because that's all that mattered. Also, you couldn't get a job in anything medical because women's hands were too dainty, apparently, which I'm like, wouldn't it make more sense if your hands were dainty? You weren't allowed to wear colors, because it would mean you were a whore. You weren't allowed to wear your hair in braids because it would mean that you weren't a virgin. You
Okay.
weren't allowed to wear gold because it meant that you had a sugar daddy. And you weren't allowed to wear high heels that have open toes because that would mean you were a prostitute. You had to go to church 3 times a week. If you didn't, you were a whore. You have to. There's a lot. There's a lot. If you went to, if you got to go to school, oh, that was another thing. School was a privilege for a girl, it was mandatory for men, it was a privilege if you were a girl. You weren't allowed to speak after a man because if you did, it would mean that you were too argumentative. You had to be completely submissive, you weren't allowed to talk during school, if you did, you could I got punished because I may have an opinion. I got sent to, we don't have principals, we have and this was like when I was in sixth grade, I got sent to the principal's office and got threatened to be expelled because I said that I didn't like the way the teacher was talking to me, who was a male, so I got in trouble and I got threatened to be expelled. You're not allowed to speak too loudly if you're at a restaurant, you're not allowed to order for yourself. If you do, you're considered argumentative. I can keep going.
So many rules.
If you're in the military, you have to wear skirts. If you wear pants, you're gay. That's another thing. If you wear pants, you will be a disappointment because people will think you're gay, and if you're gay, it's a bad thing, obviously, for them. I don't know.
I mean, it makes it easy to identify.
Yes, right.
Okay.
You're not allowed to wear earrings that don't have to your face. If you do, you're a whore. You're not allowed to wear any flashy jewelry, period. And you're not allowed to wear too much makeup. If you do, you're a whore.
So bottom line, if you break rules, you're a whore. Check, okay.
At least 6.
Okay. Yeah. Sit down and be quiet, look pretty, but you can't look too pretty because then you're a whore.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can add that to the Barbie rant, or you're a whore, right? You can't see it anymore, right? So, but I love that you're mentioning all that because it gets at how cultural gender can be, right? Every culture has different norms for gender, right? And while some of those might be a little bit true here, right? Maybe not to the extreme that they clearly are in other places, right? So we get this cultural component to gender where depending on where you are, right, there are different rules, right? And it sounds like, some places way stricter than others.
Sorry, different, but the fear that they put into you when you're such a little kid, I still dress, if you can see what I'm wearing, I am literally wearing an effing turtleneck. It is like 82 degrees outside because
It was beautiful this morning.
But I was so scared as a little kid that I was perceived wrong. I'm a disappointment, and people won't talk to you if you're perceived incorrectly, and that's a whole other thing. So I still wear,
Sure.
I wear all black all the time. It's not because I'm female. It's because I literally have fear that has been ingrained into me since I could understand English, and a lot of other Russian women see the same thing. Most of the time we wear hoods to cover our hair because showing your hair too much can be considered like
You're a whore.
promiscuous. Yeah, you're a whore.
Just to summarize, right?
Yeah, you're a whore, that's and the fear of just being not accepted as a woman in Russian society is so damaging. A lot of women actually do commit suicide. We have one of the highest suicide rates in women in Russia because of how strict the rules are in society. And so when it comes to stereotypes, I like to yap a lot because I'm like, oh, I lived it. And it still influences me to this day. Like, you will never see me with my hair up, you will never see me wearing colors. Like, it's just, I'm trying to break out of it, but it's just how they just shove it down your throat.
So
Like,
when
you
you're-
don't act like this, if you don't, you will not be loved. Like, that's what they say.
And it's ingrained here too, but maybe not as harshly, right? But there are consequences for breaking gender, right? And I would like to hope that they're getting better, but it's still very much there, right? Other thoughts for women, that's a lot, right? But no, I love it, thank you. What are some of the other stereotypes for women? Yeah.
Maternal.
Okay, gotta be maternal, right? Gotta be a mom, gotta have kids, gotta be maternal. Those are definitely, that's a big one for women. What else? What are some other ones for women? Yeah, okay, right, nice. Other stuff?
Cooking.
Cooking, right? Gotta be. What was that?
Expectation about looks.
Okay, looks, cooking, yeah,
Nurturing.
okay, kind of with the motherly thing, right? You gotta be kind and warm and nurturing. Other stuff? Yeah, okay, yeah,
Weird because it's human.
right.
So.
Not much you can do about that, right? Yeah, okay,
Materialistic.
okay, for sure. Was that a hand again?
Yeah, I was saying like small, like petite.
Okay, gotta be petite. Other stuff? We'll look over here, quiet over here. Anybody?
Like.
Yeah, okay. Right, so the opposite of men here, like overly emotional. Yeah,
Don't take up space.
okay, don't take up space. Other stuff? Looking at all of these. Other stuff? Yeah,
You can't really be in positions of power.
okay, right, submissive, right, not in positions of power. Over here, right, babies, respect, shoes, security, love, talk, right? Like, again, stereotypes for each, and sometimes these are true, right? There are plenty of people who fit the stereotypes of gender, and there are plenty of people who don't, and again, very cultural, very different from place to place. But we're all raised with some notion of what it means to be like masculine or feminine, or male or female. They're used so interchangeably. And I would venture to bet, and this was just coming into my mind as like you were talking and as people were sharing things. I want you all to think of something for a moment. You're not turning it in, but just, you could write it down if that helps you, or just think about it. I want you to think about what we sometimes call like a gender light bulb moment, right? A moment that you had some point in your life, probably when you were younger, but it could very easily be now, right? A gender light bulb moment. So a moment where you became aware of being treated differently because of your gender, right? Whatever your gender might be, right? And we could say sex or gender if that makes it easier. So for example, like a little girl who wants to play football, but is told she can't because that's a boy's sport, right? Or a little boy who wants to play with dolls, but is told that he can't because those are for girls and then gets hit, right? Like, so those would be like a gender light bulb moment, the moment where you were told or it was expressed to you that you couldn't do or should do something based on your gender. I want to give you just a moment to kind of, you could jot it down if you want to, or just think about it. I'm going to give you a moment and I'll see if anyone's willing to share, but think about like a moment in your life, right? So I'm going to give you just a minute and then I'll see if any of you will share. Write it down if you want to, if that helps you. I'm going to give you a minute. How many of you have one like in your mind? Quickly. You have one come to your mind? I have so many. I'm struggling to like pick one in my mind. But like gender and gender identity is something that I feel like I've really battled like my whole life, right? Because I don't conform to gender, right? So it's something that's like very like powerful for me. But can anyone think of one? Anyone want to share one? Yeah.
But, I've always grown up around sports. My family, we're really big sports fans. I watch baseball, football, hockey, like pretty much anything. So I also like grew up playing catch with my dad a lot, and we would play with a baseball. Why not a softball? I don't know, but we played with baseball. And my neighbor's dad came outside one time and he saw me like throwing the baseball, and he was like, "You don't throw like a girl." And I told him, I was like, "What does that mean?"
Yeah, what does that even mean?
And he was like, you don't throw like a girl, you throw really hard. And I was like, don't say that to me.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just throwing a baseball.
Yeah.
And also like, in conversation, typically like when I'm around men, if we're like talking about sports, if I try to like talk about it, I am definitely like far more ignored than the other men.
Okay.
Because if they don't, I feel like because I'm a woman, they feel like I might not understand it as much, but no, I'm like, I'm sure I know more about some stuff than you, especially like in hockey, because just hockey's not very popular. So when I like start like talking about sports, people are always like, "Oh my God, you know a lot about sports." I'm like,
why is that shocking?
"Well,
Right?
that's shocking."
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I'll go here and then here. Yeah.
Similar to
like during COVID, I got really like into the gym and like weightlifting, and I was just like complaining like to my cousin the other day, because he's a guy and he's like the one that like initially like got me into it, helped it a lot. And so even from the beginning, like I've learned like through a guy's perspective, and like I feel like for like especially like fitness, like people say like, you know, girls are more like Pilates, cardio, abs, and then guys it's like weightlifting, strength,
Sure.
right? So like I totally get that. Like I'll talk to like guys about it, or I try to like conversate, and they're like, oh, but you do this, or oh, but you should. And I'm like, you're saying everything that I literally already know.
Yeah.
And like I'll try to talk to them like about like, you know, where can we be, and like, you know, I understand what you're saying, and I'm trying to like also put my input. And the same thing, they're like trying to teach me or trying to like they assume that I don't know, and I'm like, this is so okay, whatever.
Yeah, that's another.
I think definitely like the assumption that girls like when it comes to like more manly things, like they just assume like you don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you have your.
I also have a lot that came to mind at first, and so I picked the very first one.
Sure.
As young as I can remember, in elementary school, obviously, I'm sure you can't tell, but I was very small then too, but I was also very fast. And I would like race all of my guy friends, and just, I never really had someone tell me that I couldn't do something, because I grew up in a family where I was like the oldest boy. So I got to learn how to do all those things, and they never discouraged me to do those things, like the men in my life. But, it's just I noticed the shock is when I had that realization that I could do those things.
Okay.
Like I was the fastest kid in my grade or whatever at like 7.
Mhm.
Great, fantastic. That's not really a big accomplishment now, but like whatever. And people were like, no. And I'm like, yes, you can watch me race the other guys if you want.
Sure.
Like we did it over and over again
Yeah.
every day. And so I got faster and faster, and people just couldn't fathom. And like also I was a gymnast for 6 years. And so I have some upper body strength that a lot of women don't have.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot I can do. And I used to manage a wrestling team at my high school with my friend. And when they were out doing drills outside, I would just climb on and use the equipment while they were gone, and they'd come back, and like there was one day they came back, I was at the top of the rope, and they're like, like they could not fathom
Yeah.
how to do that. And I
There's
was
no way that you'd be able to climb
Yeah.
that, right?
like, it's not even hard, guys.
Yeah.
It just takes repetition.
Right, and that speed somehow could be linked to gender.
Yeah.
Right, like, yeah. Wow, interesting. Other people, any other thoughts? Yeah.
I remember when my sister was kind of like building her sense of self and the way that she liked to dress. She would wear like a lot of clothes from like the boys' clothes section, and my parents were like, oh, yeah, she's just a tomboy, it's like, that's a thing that we can accept. I remember that conversation because I asked them like, is there another option, but the other way, but like for me, is that a thing? And then
Yeah,
they got really concerned.
that you might be interested in wearing things that were like feminine.
Yeah, like
Mhm.
completely the opposite reaction.
Yeah,
It's very strange.
and it does tend to be like stereotypically or more frequently, like we tend to view like male transgressions with gender harshly. Right, like, I mean, it can be for women too, but like the fact that there was no response, right, is telling, yeah.
Initially, when I come out to my dad, he didn't, he is, never to my face, just in general.
Sure.
But overall, he was like, you know, I kind of questioned because, you know, your closet is full of flannels, and I was like,
Okay.
And it was at the time full of flannels, but like, that's true regardless, but it was the fact that like, that was the stereotype of being bisexual and everything was that, like, oh yeah.
You have flannels.
Yeah, I wore flannels and a lot of jeans and everything.
So are we taking away that if you wear flannels and pants? Right?
Flannels can be.
Right, they have consequences. We sound like humans. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I think a classic one that probably everyone went through was like in elementary school when like the teacher's like, I need some big, strong boys to
I
bring us
know.
up to shine there." And then the front of the class every time. And she's like, only boys.
The way you said that, I'm like, that has to be the big strong voice. And you know, it's interesting. We had here, so I want to say it was like 4 or 5 years. It was before COVID, right? And they were having this whole conversation about if there's a shooter, to find strong male classmates male classmates, like students that could stand at the door to help fight them off. And like, oh, you should have seen the response. Like, a bunch of educators, everyone was like, well, it could be strong anyone. Like anybody, but like the stereotype of like, I'm gonna need some like strong boys, right? To do that. And like, oh, elementary school is the worst. My kids, they're in 5th grade now, my youngest. But when they were in kindergarten, they would bring home these worksheets. And it was like, the girl is good, which one does the girl go with? Right, and it would be like jobs that women should have, and like, oh, we're so progressive in my household that my kids would send them back with like, they could do all of them. And then the teachers would get mad, of like, no, you need to pick the girl job. They were like, what's a girl? Like, my partner and I going to like storm them, like, what's the girl job? She's ready to fight for her kids, who were like, got points taken off because they didn't serve the right answer. This was 4 years ago, like 5 years ago, I guess. So there's so many of these stereotypes, and like, just think about it in your head over the course of the day, like the messages that you receive throughout your life from parents or films or society or whatnot. And then next time when I see you, not on Monday, because we have a holiday, when I see you, we'll talk a little bit more about gender roles. I have some kind of, have a long video compilation to put together that I think is kind of interesting, and we'll keep going. I have a bunch of Oreos from my previous class if any of you want them. I left them out for you. Have a wonderful long weekend, and I will see you all on Wednesday. See you in a week.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's not.